Hi, everyone. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Freese, and today we're finishing up my series on the players the Vikings drafted. This will be the 5th episode of the series. I previously have episodes out on Donovan Jackson, Ty Felton, Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, and Kobe King. You can check that out wherever you're listening to this podcast. But this one is going to be about, obviously, the Vikings' 5th and final draft pick, Gavin Bartholomew. He's a tight end out of Pitt. He was drafted 202 overall, right? So the Vikings had back-to-back picks. They ended up taking King at 201 and Bartholomew at 202. As a tight end, it very clearly fills a need that the Vikings had. Obviously, they had Johnny Munt walk in free agency. He got a decent contract from the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Vikings have a void at the position now. Because they simply only had Josh Oliver and TJ Hawkinson under contract. I don't know. Maybe I could look it up, and that's bad of me, but they might have had some practice squad player under contract, but really the only two players with the NFL experience were Hawkinson and Oliver at all. So they added Bartholomew as well as two undrafted free agents who I haven't had the opportunity to watch yet, in Ben Urosek and Bryson Nesbitt. But Bartholomew, obviously, with the biggest investment, has the inside track to make the roster. So with the Vikings needing a tight end 3, Johnny Munt had something like 400 offensive snaps last year. Now, part of that was due to TJ Hawkinson's injury, but he still had, 10 to 20 snaps a game after Hawkinson came back, right? It wasn't like he was never used. The Vikings like to use two tight ends quite a bit in their offensive design. So, this third tight end position is something that's going to see the field. Tight end with receiver, you have to go over route running, you have to go over the ability to catch the ball, you want to look at after the catch, and you put more emphasis on blocking, right? In the Ty Felton episode, I kind of broke it down from release all the way down to the blocking aspect. For Bartholomew, I don't do the releases much for tight ends because they don't end up on the line of scrimmage all that often, right? Or pressed, I guess, all that often. There are circumstances where, they get chucked by linebackers, but as a tight end, you're not really lining up against the opponent's best corner, right? You're typically attached to the formation as a blocker, or maybe wide out in the slot or in a bunch of some sort where you might have a free release or the person across from you isn't pressing you. And a lot of times that player is a linebacker instead of a corner, right? Or maybe a safety. So they're not going to be as comfortable in press technique as corners are. So you don't really have to face a lot of press as a tight end, which is kind of interesting, right? Because you're the bigger player compared to a receiver. You'd think you'd be more physically adept at getting through press, but just based on the way the defenses play it, and maybe that's part of the reason why, right, you don't have to face press a lot. With that being said, as a tight end, you're still going to have to fight through trash, right? Like, you're going to have to check release where you put a shoulder into a defensive end that's pass rushing to slow them down a little bit, chipping guys before you release out on the route, or you're going to have to deal with a linebacker who tries to get in your way down the field in a zone, and you're going to have to either get around him or kind of work through him or deal with that contact that he gives you. So, there is a little bit of a physicality aspect to it, and I think Bartholomew does an okay job of that. I should take a step back here and go over the, physical profile for Bartholomew, right? So he's 6'4", just under 6'5", 246 pounds, and he had pretty good testing numbers, right? A 4.47 40-yard dash, 164 10-yard split, a 36.5-inch vertical, 10.2 broad, 4.3 second shuttle, and an impressive 7-second 3-cone. It's kind of interesting because if you look at Bartholomew's athletic profile, it lines up almost identical to TJ Hawkinson. Bartholomew's 6'04.5", which in parlance is 6'4" and 5/8". Hawkinson was 6'04.6", right? 251. Bartholomew's 246. But all these times are nearly the same. Hawkinson ran the identical 4.7 40-yard dash. He had a 1.63 10-yard split. Bartholomew's is 1/100th of a second slower than that, right? 1.64. Hawkinson jumped 37.5-inch vert. Bartholomew 36.5, as I mentioned. A 10.3 broad for Hawkinson, where it's 10.2 for Bartholomew. So 1 inch off on both of those, right? Like extremely close in comparison. Hawkinson's 3-cone was 7.02. Bartholomew's was 7, right? The shuttle 4.18 for TJ Hawkinson and 4.3 for Bartholomew. So Bartholomew's a little lower there, and he's got a little less weight, but like this is a nearly identical athletic profile down the list. So I think you can kind of see from an athleticism perspective what Bartholomew, might have, what the Vikings might have seen in Bartholomew in terms of his overall potential. I don't think there are any athletic limitations with who he is as a player that are going to hold him back from becoming, an all-around tight end. And TJ Hawkinson's one of the better all-around tight ends in the NFL. With that being said, obviously as a 6th-round pick, I don't think Gavin Bartholomew is there yet, and we'll get to that throughout the tape, but I'm pretty encouraged from the athletic profile and from what I saw on tape that he can become a valuable player. So the first thing I saw that I liked with Bartholomew, if I go back to the, aspect of release versus not release, is there was a rep against Boston College, and I was able to watch 3 games of his, but I was only able to cut up the tape for the Boston College game. So I had SMU, Clemson, and Boston College were the 3 games I was able to watch. So if you want to see visual for some of this, you can go over to my article on zone coverage that I wrote on Bartholomew. Just search my name in there. But on this play against Boston College, right, Bartholomew is up against a linebacker who tries to get physical with him and punch him and slow him down as he gets off of the line of scrimmage. And he uses really good technique to step inside, use his hands to knock the opponent's hands away, and then restack him vertically, right? So when I talk about stacking, something I talked about in the Ty Felton episode is, he has to get around this linebacker, but he wants to stay as true to his route path as possible. So ideally, you want to run in a straight line. But if you have to go around another player, you want to go either inside or outside of them and then lean back to the original path that you're on, right? So if you're drawing a straight line, you get back on that straight line from where you started. And that's called restacking the player or stacking the defender. I thought he did a really good job on this rep, and I think he shows the ability to do that vertically, which is a technical thing from a route running perspective that I really like to see in players, because when you stack a defender, it makes it really hard for them to come back into the picture underneath you. They have to go through you to get to the theoretical ball, and that is, even when the ball is underthrown, you can kind of go through them and get defensive pass interference, right? Because you're trying to fight back through them once you turn around for the ball. If they're to your side, they can more easily knock it down, or you have a lot harder time fighting back through them, and you kind of have to fight them to the side, and they probably aren't as likely to get a penalty in those scenarios. So, that ability to stack was something I thought was positive. I also thought he can be a true vertical threat as a tight end, which isn't something you see from the lesser athletes at tight end, right? A 4.7 isn't necessarily the fastest 40 in the world, but it's not slow either, right? Like he can still threaten vertically, and he's got long strides to be able to eat up ground down the field. There are a couple examples of clear outs where he's able to run the clear out, create space underneath for his teammates. And that's really a positive thing, I think, and not something you necessarily expect from a third tight end, right? Being able to threaten vertically is something the better tight ends in the league are able to do, there, where you have guys who are like let's say a Jake Ferguson, right, isn't a vertical threat at tight end. He's a reliable underneath option, but he's not a vertical threat. It takes a more rare receiver to be able to do that down the field. And I think Bartholomew's route running down the field backs up his vertical threat ability. There was a pretty good corner route that he ran in the Boston College game where he ends up selling vertical. And this is something I talked about a lot in the Ty Velton video as well, where there's a storytelling aspect to route running, right? You have to sell your opponent on what you're doing. So he has to step outside to get around a defender, but he turns his route back vertically and then snaps. He uses his hand on contact and then snaps hard off to the corner, which creates clear separation away from the defender. It's the sharp angles and breaks with the route are what I really like to see in players, and he's able to do that. I also think his weight drop is pretty good for a player of his size. Like, it's not perfect, and he probably takes a step or two more than what you would expect a high-level wide receiver to take, but you have to understand that this player is 240 pounds instead of a 200-pounder or like a 183-pound receiver in what Ty Velton is, right? So it's just a lot more momentum to stop and turn around when he's trying to make these breaks. So he sinks his hips, I think, pretty well, and is able to turn around within, 3 to 5 steps, with the ideal being 3. And that combination works really well. He caught a curl route for a touchdown against Boston College where he was able to drop his weight. It was able to push the safety off, create separation, and he comes back to the ball at he goes, 5 yards into the end zone, turns around, comes back towards the football, catches it for the touchdown. It's just a nuanced combination of route running that I wasn't necessarily expecting to see from a tight end and from a 6th-round pick. Now, I say that and I give the compliments, but I don't think the route running was as consistently there as I would like to see, right? I talked about a couple highlights, and I think he's really good at running downfield routes, but there are some intermediate routes and some routes over the ball that I think might be not as in his wheelhouse. There was a dig route that he was trying to run, and he ended up super upright. That was something else I talked about in the Ty Velton video, right? Where as a receiver, you want to keep your pads as low as possible for as long as possible to hide the point where you're going to break on your route. Keeping your pads low and you having forward lean in your route gives your opponent the impression that you're running full speed forward. So as soon as you start to straighten up, they kind of can anticipate you breaking and you turning on that route, right? I thought he got super upright on this inside route, and then there was a linebacker where he was about to break, and he got really focused on hand fighting with this linebacker and dismissing it, and really did not think about, and I don't know if it just wasn't natural to him in terms of taking the steps to make the turn and dropping his weight, and it's something he still has to think about, which could be a concern, right? You want that to come naturally as part of your movements on the route, but he didn't sink his hips and drop his weight to turn, and it really slowed down the break and made him easy to cover in this case. So that kind of route running, is something that certainly needs to be improved on, but I like that the athletic tools are there. I like that I see him run good routes relatively consistently, and I think the poor routes are more something that needs to be cleaned up rather than something that needs to happen so much more often that I question whether or not he's going to be able to get through and do it. Against zone, which is another aspect to route running, right? It's a different feel against zone than it is against man coverage, where against man, you're literally trying to create separation from the player against you, right? You're trying to run away from your opponent. Against zone, you have to have more of a feel to sit down in the areas that are open, and you kind of have to understand where your opponent's landmarks are going to be and where they're going to try to cover you, and you have to kind of find the space within that coverage. And I thought that Bartholomew kind of failed on the spacing aspect of things in a couple times. There was an interception on the in the Boston College game that the quarterback threw, where he has an in-breaking route. It's kind of like a dig, and you really want him to sit in the window between a couple linebackers, right? So he's running vertical, and then with the linebacker coverage, you need him to get around the first one, wrap around the first one, but kind of sit in between him and the second one, and he drifts towards the inside. Now, as he turns around, he's looking back for the ball. So, it just may be he sees the quarterback is already throwing it, because it looks like the quarterback is trying to make an anticipation throw, and he's trying to work towards where the ball is going. But I think he gets a little bit too far into the linebacker area, and the underneath linebacker is able to jump up and pick off the pass. So I'd like to have seen his spacing get a little bit better in there, where he did not end up going far enough to get into that linebacker. But at the end of the day, this one might just be on the quarterback. There was another play, however, where he's running a now return route, right? And that's like people call it a whip route, but he cuts inside and then loops back around outside. That's what the return is. And he does a really good job on the route. I think he sinks well and explodes out of that route, getting towards the sideline. But the quarterback then has to scramble out of the pocket. And Bartholomew just runs out of bounds. I mean, he continues running the route to the point he's out of bounds. He tries to turn upfield, but it's too late, right? And he steps out of bounds and takes himself out of the play. Like, that's the kind of, I would hope that he has better spatial awareness than that, right? To completely take himself out of the play, because he didn't realize he was running too close to the sideline. That's something I would definitely monitor and hope that he's able to improve, right, as he continues to grow as a player, because I think it has a similar thing, like it's similar to the idea of finding spacing in zone, right? Having the awareness of where the holes open are potentially open in zone is pretty similar to the idea of understanding where you are in relation to the sideline on the field, right? There are particular landmarks where your opponents are trying to hit and when you're trying to hit with your route, and you need to understand how those relate to each other, right? So that is, I guess, an open question I would have with Bartholomew, is his understanding of coverages and his understanding of the spacing in the field and where to fit in zone. Now, again, like I think he has pretty good tools as a route runner. He can get open on a relatively consistent basis, or he runs pretty well or he runs routes pretty well generally. He needs to work on spacing a little bit. That's pretty much his route running. Let's flip it over to after the catch, or at the catch point and after the catch, right? That was the next section I put together in my article. There weren't a ton of targets in the games that I watched. Like, he wasn't a super utilized tight end, but I thought he was pretty effective as a receiver overall from the tight end position. The thing is, I do think he needs to overhaul his catch technique. He catches the ball pretty well when it's high, when it's above the belt, but he had a couple drops and true mishaps on lower throws that make me question his ability to adjust underhand, and the fact that he lets the ball into his body when he tries to catch underhand. So ideally, when you're catching a pass, you want to have your arms extended out away from your frame. Overhand, that's kind of with your hands together in a triangle, right? And your arms are extended as far as you can, out away from your frame. And the reason you want it out away from the frame is if you're not able to grasp the ball on the first one, you're going to slow the ball's momentum down, right? So as you slow the ball's momentum down, you have a second opportunity to catch it as it comes toward you if you hit and it keeps going, because it's not going to bounce directly the other direction. It's going to knock your hands back and kind of slow it down a little bit, and it might lead to a double catch, but it's better than if the ball bounces off your arms, bounces into your chest, and then bounces out away from you, you've dropped the ball, right? And that's kind of what Bartholomew does on throws that are like at his like stomach or below, where he underhands it, but his arms are tight to his frame. So he's really trying to trap the ball against his frame, then catch it out with his hands and then bring it in. And I think that's a pretty significant problem. It led to a drop against Boston College. It led to a drop against Clemson, where he just has the ball bounce off of his hands, bounce off of his chest, and into the ground, right? So that's really a concern for me and something he needs to clean up, because as a tight end, you want them to be a reliable target, right? You can live with a couple concentration drops from a receiver every now and then if they're catching most of their passes. As a tight end, you're asking them to do dirty work and convert third downs and things like that, and you really can't have them drop the ball on a consistent basis. There was another interception on the tape against Boston College where the quarterback threw the ball high. It was a super late throw. Bartholomew got collisioned by a linebacker immediately and really had to try to adjust to a throw that was over his head. It just bounced off of his hands into the arms of the defender. I don't really hold that one against him as much, because it was a very difficult situation for Bartholomew to adjust to. But it's worth pointing out that, even overhand, he struggled a little bit to make the catch. Now, the Clemson game is a little bit better example of where he was able to make a couple highlight catches in that game, including a diving catch on a wheel route, right? So he had a wheel route in man coverage against the linebacker, completely outran the linebacker, made a diving catch going to the ground for a touchdown. It was a pretty spectacular play. I was really happy with that. I think it shows his ability to adjust outside of his frame to make catches. So that's definitely a positive. We just need to clean up the technique and make sure we're extending our arms away from the frame with Bartholomew so we can make those catches on a more consistent basis. And that's not something that's necessarily easy to do, right? It's natural for him to catch this way. So I'm really hopeful that he can turn it around and become better at making catches away from his frame as he enters the NFL level, but it's certainly not a guarantee. One thing I do like about Bartholomew is, after he makes the catch, I think he transitions really fluidly to being a receiver, and I think he's a really good after the catch athlete. To refer back to my Ty Felton podcast again, I talked about how on screens Ty Felton often chose the wrong direction to run, right? He was following his blockers with the incorrect leverage. That's not a problem for Gavin Bartholomew at all. He understands the leverage that his blockers have, and not only understands that, but can make players miss once the defensive or the defenders get to him, right? So you want to follow the backs of your blockers, right? And on this play against Boston College, he has his blocker, is blocking a defensive back out. So he comes inside, is blocking the corner, and is his back is towards the middle of the field. So Gavin Bartholomew needs to go inside of him and up the hash. He does that, but the defender runs through the wide receiver blocking so well that he's able to get his hands on Bartholomew. It doesn't matter to Bartholomew. He spins out of the contact, gets towards the sideline, and is able to accelerate and gain extra yardage after the spin move after contact. There were a couple shovel passes that he got that I thought he did a good job of making the first defender miss. There was one where he followed his blockers directly for a touchdown. Just some really good after the catch work from Bartholomew. And not something that you necessarily expect from a tight end, but certainly a positive to see from him. So that's kind of Bartholomew as a receiver, right? He's a good route runner, not perfect, with some blemishes at the catch point, but the promise to get a little bit better there, and a really strong after the catch player, in my opinion. But that's only half of the job of an NFL tight end, right? The other half is blocking. And the first rep I saw of Gavin Bartholomew in the Boston College game, I thought is really indicative of who I think he can be as a player. He is an H-back, let's say, in this play, right? He's an off-the-ball tight end who was tasked with pulling around through the line of scrimmage and, executing a zone or executing a pull, right? So he's pulling around the line of scrimmage. He has a linebacker or safety target. He kind of has to choose as he gets through. There's a teammate that's climbing up to the linebacker level and is not attached to this linebacker yet. Bartholomew puts his shoulder into this linebacker, helps his teammate win the block, and then kicks out a safety that's coming downhill, latches onto him and kicks him out and creates a running lane. Now, on the play, there was a blown block elsewhere, and it went for a tackle for loss, right? But it was a really good processing and really good block from Gavin Bartholomew to get in position to help his teammate without giving too much force, right? And leaving his teammate out to dry by knocking the defender past him, and then also getting off of that block quickly and transitioning to the player he was actually supposed to block in the safety and putting himself in good position to block that player out of the way and create a running lane for the running back. Just because the running back wasn't able to hit that running lane because he got tackled in the backfield doesn't mean it wasn't a good block by Bartholomew, right? I think it showed really good mental processing from Bartholomew to be able to hit both of those things at the same time, the athleticism to get through the hole and, be able to move and hit both of those. I think it was pretty good. I was just really impressed with that. As a blocker, I think he has a really good understanding of positioning. He can block edges one-on-one. He did it against Donovan Izaraku, who was a second-round pick by the Cowboys, where he found the position and turned him out of the way, created the running lane for the running back, and drove Izaraku back a couple steps, right? It's not like he's going to go in there and drive back defensive tackles, but he showed a flash of being able to do it against a defensive end who's an NFL caliber player. I think that's really important to see from the tape. He's not the biggest player in the world, right? At 246 pounds, like that's not as big as a lot of the edge rushers you're going up against. I would want him to put a little more weight on the frame. He definitely does not have the strength that some of the best tight ends in the NFL do, but the flashes are there of him being able to do it against high level competition that make me at least hopeful for him transitioning as a blocker in the NFL. In addition to that, in the run game where he's got really good positioning and the ability to turn players away from the running lane, I thought there were a couple reps where he showed really good anchor and pass protection. He didn't have a ton of pass protection reps from what I saw, but another one against Boston College, against the end opposite, Izaraku kind of bull rushed him. He was able to take steps back, take a hop back, and anchor, eventually leaving space for the quarterback on the rep. There are definitely positives to his profile as a blocker, and I wanted to highlight those first before getting into a couple of the negatives, because I think he's a workable player at the NFL level, honestly, like right away. You can ask him to try to get position against defensive ends, and he's going to be able to execute that in certain circumstances. You don't want to ask him to block a dominant edge rusher one-on-one. You don't want to ask most tackles to block a dominant edge rusher one-on-one. But against a secondary rusher or kind of away from the play, I think he can hold his own one-on-one against edge rushers at least a little bit early on in his career. And a lot of times at the NFL level, you don't have to block guys one-on-one as a tight end. I think it's kind of a death sentence to ask guys to do that unless they're Rob Gronkowski. But you'll have the tight end work with the running back in a protection scheme, and you try to do 2-on-1 on the defensive player and make that work, right? I think I've seen enough from Bartholomew's ability to combo that I think he might be able to do that at the NFL level and have the pair of him and CJ Ham in the backfield, or Aaron Jones, or whoever it is, Jordan Mason, kind of make that work, right? With that being said, he was not great when he went one-on-one against Donovan Izaraku in the pass game, right? And that's a second round edge rusher. Some people had him as a first rounder. It's a pretty high level prospect that he's going against. But as I talked about in the Donovan Jackson video, you're going up against a team's Abdul Carter every single week, pretty much, right? You have a ton of good edge players in the NFL, and a lot of guys who are obviously better than Donovan Izaraku. So you're going to have to face this at the NFL level and kind of hold up. I think that Bartholomew leans a bit in his pass protection, right? So what I mean by that is when you get into your pass set, you want to throw your punch, but you want to be balanced in your punch. A problem tons of guys have is that they lean too far forward, right? You put a lot of force into your punch, it causes your back to bend forward and you almost bend over, and that leaves you really susceptible if your opponent's able to knock your hands down for them swimming over the top of you, getting right around you if they do that with quickness. Izaraku did that a couple times, right? He really kind of got a sack against Bartholomew because he leaned too far forward, and then in the run game, he did the exact same thing, swimming over him as Bartholomew leaned too far forward. So I think with Bartholomew as a blocker, right, you see his lack of size come into play a little bit, or his lack of mass come into play a little bit in those circumstances, right? He's trying to hit a bit too hard. He gets far out because he thinks he's undersized. He gets far out over himself, and it turns into a disaster, right? I don't know how often that's going to be an impact in the NFL, because I wouldn't expect him to be asked to, take on edge rushers one-on-one in the pass rush game, right? I wouldn't expect him to not have a double team in certain circumstances in the run game. Now, if the Vikings are running duo, right, he may need to hold up against an edge rusher a little bit better. And the Vikings do run a lot of duo, so that's something that we might want to grow in his game. But you can also just not ask him to do that and have Josh Oliver on those plays instead, as he tries to get stronger as a player. As a move player, as like an H-back, right, where you're asking him to like split block a lot more often, that's cross the formation and kick out a defensive end, or cross the formation and kind of pull through and, block a player at the second level. I think he's absolutely got the movement skills to do that. I think he's got the movement skills to reach players on zone runs or do a backside cutoff against a defensive end, right, where on a zone play, you want to get in front of the defensive end and kind of cut him to prevent him from taking away the cutback lane that the running back has on that play. I think all that athletic ability is there for Gavin Bartholomew, which makes me pretty high on him as a blocker. Like, from a technical perspective, I think he needs to stop leaning forward. From a play strength perspective, I think he absolutely needs to gain mass to be able to do this at the NFL level. But I think he's a really competitive player as a blocker at the college football level. So I am hopeful that he's able to gain that strength and transition over to somebody who's really good at it at the NFL level. So if you can't tell from the way I'm framing this, I'm really high on the pick of Gavin Bartholomew. I think he has the capacity to get in right away as a tight end 3, right? I think you want to ask TJ Hawkinson and Josh Oliver to do the more difficult blocking responsibilities, but I think if one of those needs a break, and you don't want to put Hawkinson and Oliver on the field at the same time for whatever reason, you can sub in Gavin Bartholomew and he can be competitive as that H-back, as that not wide tight end, but it's different in different systems, right? But F tight end, let's say, or H back. And that doesn't necessarily mean lining up in the backfield or lining up off the line of scrimmage. Like, I think he can be isolated as a Y in certain circumstances as somebody who's truly on the line of scrimmage. You just don't want to ask him to do really hard blocking stuff at this point in his career. But I think, if for some reason TJ Hawkinson, let's say, gets injured again, right, and you need to play him as a true tight end, swapping out with Josh Oliver, I think he does certain things that make you really, excited about that potential, particularly his route running down the field, right? His ability to get vertical and win down the field, I think, is going to be an asset to his game, and something that you don't see from a lot of third tight ends across the league. Kind of that move capability, I think, can threaten defenses vertically and has the potential to develop into somebody who's a true starting tight end in the NFL, rather than somebody who's always cast as kind of that third tight end role, or maybe a second blocking tight end, which is what Josh Oliver is, who's maybe going to be a safety blanket for you in the passing game, but isn't going to unlock anything. I think Gavin Bartholomew has the potential to unlock things, right? And I I'm not saying he's going to be that right away from week 1 in the NFL, but I think you can put him on the field in week 1 in the NFL. And I'm really excited for that potential because I don't think that's something you can say about a couple other of the Vikings draft picks, right? So it's kind of interesting to me, or it was interesting to me, that I like this guy for the role that I expect him to play right now. And I think he has the potential to expand beyond that. So yeah, that's Gavin Bartholomew, right? I think he is a dynamic athlete down the field. Like, he's not going to blow you away with his speed, I guess, but I think he can threaten vertically. I think he can run vertical routes really well. I think he needs to expand his understanding of spacing and zone, right? That's something he needs to improve upon in his game. The catch concern is the trapdoor for me with Bartholomew, right? If he can't consistently catch the football, that's going to get you off of teams very quickly, especially as a position that's supposed to be a safety blanket as tight end, right? So he really needs to clean up that underhand catch technique where he lets the ball into, and even an overhand catch technique where he lets the ball into his frame way too often. I think he does have the ability to catch passes outside of his frame, so that's a positive, but it's the routine stuff that I think he needs to do a better job of, or he's going to get plagued with drops at the NFL level. So that's the trapdoor on his game. But once he does catch the ball, I think he transitions to a runner really quickly and can make guys miss. Like, he's a pretty good after the catch runner, especially for a tight end, right? Like, you don't see tight ends who can spin out of stuff and make guys miss all that often. It's a pretty nice skill set, and he's got enough power to work through wraps and tackle attempts by defensive backs, which is maybe what you're more accustomed to from a tight end, even if he's not the most powerful player in the world. As a blocker, as I have previously stated, like, I think he's a higher effort player who shows an understanding of what he's supposed to do as a blocker and is able to execute that really well. Like, he understands where the run design is supposed to go and is able to put himself in position to help the offense execute that run design, right? That's not something you can say for every player. So it's really important to note that I think he does a good job executing what the offense is asking him to do. As far as from like a mental perspective and from like a positioning perspective, as far as him actually attacking defenders, like, I think technically he's pretty good. His hands get a little wide sometime. But you know, he's generally got solid technique in that game. You know, with the blemish of leaning forward too much, he can get overpowered by more physical defenders, but he has some tools to overcome that, and he's not going to get embarrassed by anybody, as far as I'm concerned, unless you're asking him to block a high quality edge rusher 1-on-1. Then you're going to be in trouble, but you're in trouble with that for most tight ends. So again, positive as a blocker, really good understanding of where he needs to go, pretty good execution on all of that, needs to gain more power, needs to get a little bit more sound and not lean forward technically against, you know, the better edge rushers in the world, which is a really difficult ask for him anyway. Like, I think he's going to be a solid chipper. He's going to be a good chip release guy because of his vertical stride and his ability to stretch the defense there. He hopefully will develop into a safe check down option if he can learn to catch a little bit better. And that is a complete tight end if he's able to do that. Now, again, that's a pretty high bar for a 6th round pick, right? But I think he can play tight end 3 right away. And even without watching the other 2 guys, like, I'm pretty happy with what Bartholomew provides as a player right now. So I wouldn't expect a different 6th round draft pick to be, or an undrafted free agent to be this good of a player. So I'm pretty comfortable with Bartholomew on the roster for the Vikings right now. And that's going to wrap it up. This is my last episode in the 5-episode series, right? On the Vikings draft picks, I went deep into the tape for all of them. You can check out the episodes on the other 4 guys on this podcast feed. You can check out my work, also its own coverage. I have individual articles on all of these guys that went up. So if you want video for any of this, including, you know, this Gavin Bartholomew episode, you can go check that out. You can find me Matt Freese is my name, at Fries Football on BlueSky. You can find my co-host Nick Olson at Nick Olson NFL on Twitter. The show is at Kindred Skulls on both Twitter and BlueSky. We're available on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Also available on YouTube. And with that, Skull Vikings.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.